Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Underneath Podcast. Welcome to the Underneath Podcast. Welcome, everybody. This is Cale Zeldin. Thank you for coming to this special live stream of the Underneath Podcast. I have got a great guest with me today, as I'm sure you all know. That's why you've logged in. And just so you know, I am kind of new at the streaming game. I'm used to recording and taking my time. So working all these controls, the branding and the whatnot is going to be a little bit of a challenge. And it's sure also working the comments might be a little bit of a challenge for me. So please bear with me. But at any rate, today I've got a special guest all the way from Budapest, Hungary, none other than the great Rod Dreher. And we are going to talk about his new book. This is what the book looks like. Living in Wonder. Yeah, it's better than my face. We're going to go ahead and hide that. But this is what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to invite Rod right in. Rod, my friend.
Hey, Cale.
Oh,
you know, I mean that in love. It's Fred G. Sanford. I mean, some folks are too young to remember him. One of the all-time American greats.
Oh, indeed, you big dummy. So I guess, does that make me Lamont here to your Fred, or am I Fred here?
Yeah, we need Aunt Esther in here to sort our chakras.
That's right. I saw you giving Aunt Esther a shout out yesterday on the Twitters. So good stuff. Good stuff.
I love her. You know, LaWanda Page, that comedian who played Aunt Esther on that show from the 70s, she was this Bible-beating fundamentalist woman. In fact, the real-life LaWanda Page worked very blue. She had such a foul mouth.
Yeah. Well, so did Red Fox. I mean, like, you know, he was, you know, the television version that we got, you know, the one from set is a pretty sanitized version, but a really funny guy, really great show. That's one of those things, if I'm ever flipping the channels, if I ever flip the channel, but you know, you stop on that one. You just watch, you watch whatever happens there. So anyway, look, I don't want to talk about this today. I want to talk about your book. You know, but we've not done this in several months here. So how are things in the great city of Budapest?
Oh, it's fine. It's fine. I'm still rocking and rolling here. I live so far north that the summer days are really long, and normally this room I'm in at home will be filled with light, but it's raining now, so alas. But things are great here. I was in Greece last week on vacation with my son, and I finished final copy of my manuscript for Living in Wonder, which is quite a relief. And because you and I are so close and I respect your judgment, I sent you a copy of it, of the manuscript, just to give a quick look over. And I'm grateful that you want to talk about today as someone who has actually read the thing. And love to know your impressions on it, because I really think that re-enchantment is going to be the next thing, the next big thing.
Yeah, you have kind of a habit of this. I've got a lot of questions. We can get into the meat of the book in just a minute, but this is the first book that you've written not in America, right? I mean, this is the first
Yeah.
book that you've written, away from things. Lots of things have changed since Live Not by Lies. But what was the writing process like for you this time around? I mean, everything's different.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it was in some ways it was easy simply because I work online and I'm still very much inside the American headspace, the media
Sure.
space, and things like that. But for me, and I talk about this in the book, before I even got started writing the book, my wife filed for divorce, and so that, that was a real blow, to put it mildly.
Sure, sure, yeah.
And it delayed. The book would be out a year earlier if not for
Mhm.
that. So that were some real challenges there. But in some ways, as the readers will see, that adversity added to the book
Mhm.
because it helped me understand that first of all, everybody suffers. I
Right.
mean, nobody's going to get through life without suffering, and usually suffering in some really difficult way. My faith got me through it, and it
Mhm.
wasn't simply a matter of reason, but just sheer faith. Faith that God was present, that God had meaning. There was meaning here in this suffering, even if I couldn't see it. And it helped bring home for me I think, the fundamental message of the book, which is uh, it's not a book about, ooh, they're angels and they're miracles and things like
Yeah.
that, though
Yeah.
that's part of it.
Mhm.
But it's like this is part of the cosmos that God has created. There is meaning embedded in everything. To live in an enchanted world is not to live in a world of fairy dust and, like it's
Mhm.
Disney everywhere, but rather to live in a world that is filled with meaning and with God's presence. And I really felt that in a way that I had never felt before, never had to feel before, as I was
Mhm.
writing this book, going through the divorce.
Well, what struck me, you start off like right from the get go. Materialism is not enough, and I was really struck by the just the you sort of just start the whole thing off with that. Was that a kind of I just have to get it out and say it up front move for you, or like what were you thinking there?
Yeah, well, I felt like I needed to hit people right up front with
Mhm.
the challenge of the book, and
Yeah.
I start out by telling two different stories that readers of my Substack will know about.
Yeah.
The first one is about was told to me in Jerusalem in 2022. I wandered into a shop in the old city looking to buy a cross or something to take back as a souvenir, having been there for Holy Week. And there was this grumpy looking British guy behind the counter. He was had a Cockney accent, and it turns out I won't drag the whole story out, but he had been in Jerusalem for 30 years. He had come there from East London, where he was a junkie. He had come to Israel because he heard there was better heroin in Tel Aviv. He nearly died from his from drugs. Decided at one point he had to get clean or he was going to die.
Yeah.
He went and sat by the banks of the Jordan River, having no religion at all, no religious background, and a miracle happened to him
Mm.
that left him clean and led to his conversion. I just walked off the street and got this story, and it's leading the book. There's a second story in there, kind of an even weirder thing, um, in which a young Catholic lawyer from Chicago contacted me. He had seen a UFO as a
Mhm.
teenager and had just not told anybody about it because it just weirded him out. And then he started receiving visitors. These humanoid beings would come there, and long story short, he ended up going to an exorcist, and that
Mhm.
fixed the problem. So I started out with those stories to say that, this world is not what we think it is.
Yeah.
And there are so many people, Cale. You've been writing and you're
Yeah.
lately and talking on Twitter about Carlos Irie. I guess that's how
Yeah.
you say his name.
Carl Air. You call it like air, like
Air.
into the air. Yeah.
Yeah, saying that, talking about the evidence that exists in Vatican archives and elsewhere of people back in, I think, the 16th century, 17th century, seeing miraculous things that could not be explained by naturalism. So the point I wanted to make in that first chapter is that, yes, these things happen. They happen a lot more than people say, but we've
Yeah.
been intimidated by society, by the triumph of scientism and secularism. into suppressing our knowledge of that. And it's time for that to stop. It just cannot be, it can't continue anymore.
Yeah, you kind of leading me to start at the end, I guess, of some of the questions that I wanted to ask you, but this is perfect, right? And I've been really immersed in the whole air thing. I worked through his whole book Reformations and then jumped right into They Flew. And then of course in watching some YouTube videos of his presentations, and it just struck me is that you've got this kind of, as mainstream normie American historian at one of the most prestigious universities in the country and certainly
An
in the
award-winning
world.
historian.
And award-winning. I mean, he's a functional materialist just from a perspective of his work. And he's like, look, guys, we simply cannot dismiss this strangeness because the power of testimony is real. And so I guess I really kind of wanted to get that with you. I mean, you tell a lot of stories in this book. And you tell a great story, but why do you think these phenomena work best in story, and what's going on there?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think it has to do with witness, the power of witness. I tell a story in the book about how one of the things that led me as a young man searching for faith to Catholicism was going to sit back in, it must have been summer of 1991, in Baton Rouge. I was a young journalist, and I was sent to interview an elderly Catholic priest who was in his 90s. Man had been born in the 1890s. About his career prior to coming to the priesthood. He had been an artist and an art professor. And the man told me a story sitting there. I was just asking him about his life, as one does as a journalist. Sweet little old man, his face was glowing, Monsignor Sanchez. And Sanchez told me about how he had been born to a wealthy family of coffee planters in Guatemala, had been sent to Yale for Dartmouth and then Yale for his education, lost his faith. Didn't dare tell his parents because he respected them. Sure. Goes back to Guatemala City when his father is nearing death and wants to have a public mass of reconciliation with the church. Sanchez knelt down to receive communion, even though he didn't believe it was real. He said that there was a burst of light that came out of the host surrounding him, and he audibly heard a voice say, "I have always loved you." He was instantly reconverted. There were more miracles that followed that led him to the priesthood. But I tell you, sitting there as a young man, maybe 23, 24 years old, young journalist, listening to that old man whose tears coming down his face like it had happened last week, when in fact it had happened like 60 years ago. That convinced me. And I
convinced you of what?
that it had really happened to him.
Right. Okay.
And it made me realize, because I had all this theoretical stuff in my head about the Catholic faith, all these theological arguments. But man, there was something about seeing that old man, listen to those words, listening to him, the power with which he spoke. It made me realize I have a choice to make. This is not just theoretical. This is real.
So I love that. We can go back to this, the claim for the real here, but I'm struck in the book. You really hit this point hard that the great temptation that we sort of live in is sort of a kind of almost an idea centric kind of mind headspace versus an experiential one. And like what's going on there? Like what you seem to point out real problems with what you call in the book the noetic, right? That there's a temptation that we all of us who sort of live here in the West, independent of our confession or non-confession, that the noetic, you said this hyper rational worldview seems to dominate. What's going on?
Yeah, well, I know you've read him too, Matthew Crawford, most famous for his book Shop Craft as Soulcraft, or Shop Class as Soulcraft. And Crawford is a philosopher, professionally trained philosopher, but also a motorcycle mechanic. And he talks in his work, not just that book, but in his subsequent work, about how important it is to live in the body and to get outside your head. His more recent book, it's called The World Outside Your Head, or The World Beyond Your Head. And he makes in there a case for how some things that are important to know about what it means to be human can only be learned through experience in the body. For example, he has a whole chapter about the making of organs, pipe organs.
And the maintenance of organs. Yeah, keep going. I love this.
Yeah. And you can't just read it in a book. You have to learn it hands-on with somebody who has experienced it. Learning how to play an instrument is the same way.
Mm-hmm.
And but he draws from this, Crawford does, broader philosophical and even anthropological conclusions that our problem today is we live too much inside our head, and our sense of what reality is actually a phantom. And we can see too, and I get into this later in the book in the chapter about AI and technology, about how we are rapidly moving into a world in which our not just part of our sense of reality is formed by technology, but all of it. And it really, I think that there is no coincidence, Cale, that the first generation in the West that has been raised entirely on the internet, they don't have any memory pre-internet, is also the one that is by far the most anxious, and the one that has grave doubts about the reality of their own bodies or their own embodiedness. This is only going to get worse.
Yeah, you make a distinction in the book that I thought was helpful. I had not seen it in the French, and you're going to have to help me with the pronunciations because my French is notoriously bad. But you talk about the difference between savoir and connaître. How do you say it slowly for my audience, because I don't know.
Savoir and connaître.
Okay.
Savoir. The verbs both mean to know in French. We only have one verb for to know in English, and but the French and Germans do this too. I forget their verbs, but savoir is to know with your head.
Mm-hmm.
If you say, like, I know I know the faith, je sais le foi, I know the faith. But connaître is to know with your heart, or to know in your body.
Yeah.
Like I can know something abstract. I can know my catechism, but I know you, Cale, in a connaître way. And so one of the things I'm hitting at in this book is that we need to we in the West need to rebalance our faith, not just our faith, but our way of approaching the world, by being less abstracted in the savoir world and more in the connaître world. These are both ways of knowing. And I draw in the book on the great Ian McGilchrist, on his teaching, and we can get into that later if you want. But his teaching that the West has, one reason it's become so powerful over the last 500 years is because it has leaned heavily into the left brain way of knowing, way of abstracting and analyzing the world and just seeing the world as just stuff, as just meaningless matter that can be recombined to fulfill our own wills.
Stuff and data, right? It's like this which is of course infinitely sortable, infinitely workable, and you said it's as if it's the real power is the power, right? In other words, but we have neglected, it seems to me, and like what I'm seeing in your book and what your work seems to be about, is that what about the stuff we've neglected? What about the stuff we've left on as not important, right? And you say early on in the book, it's that it's important to understand this project. This project, in the book, is not one of nostalgia, right? How can you help us connect that? What do you mean when you say that this project is not one of nostalgia?
Yeah, because some people think that, if we could just get back to the golden age of faith in the 1950s, or maybe the Middle Ages, however far back you want to go, an age of faith, all would be well. And we know, we quite rightly know that we can't do that. You can't unknow what you've known. We have come through enlightenment. We've come through secularism, and you can't unwind that. On the other hand, what I do challenge is the myth of progress, which says that wherever we are right now in the West is the greatest, the farthest humans have ever known about anything. What I say is, no, it's the most humans have known about some things, but we have forgotten other things that are important to know, that our ancestors in ages past knew, but we have forgotten. And it doesn't make them ignorant. Ian
Can I
McGilchrist.
interrupt you real quick
Yeah.
on that score? So we've forgotten something real. And what I love about the chapter in the Crawford book that you mentioned, right, is that this isn't, what is it, like a 75-page chapter on pipe organs. Okay. Now,
Mhm.
neither of us are pipe organ enthusiasts, right? I mean, I like organ music. I don't mean it that way, but what was remarkable to me is that when these guys pass on to their reward, something real becomes lost and becomes we lose access to something that's very real, because
Mhm.
so few of us can actually see, right, what an organ is and how an organ is constructed and how an organ like that works, right? And so what really struck me was with that chapter is that we are holders of embodied knowledge. And so I'm wondering if you can sort of, using that and McGilchrist, how what are, as we are holders of certain things, certain kinds of knowledges, what do we risk losing as we sort of evaporate further into the left hemisphere?
Well, one example that I love to bring up in my work, I've done it in past work, is what the Cambridge anthropologist Paul Connerton, who was a Marxist,
Mhm.
said based in his studies of small traditional cultures that had held on to their stories, their sense of identity in the face of the dissolving acids of modernity, which
Sure.
reduces us all to choosing individuals.
Mhm.
And he said they had certain things in common. One, they had a sacred story that they held in common
Mhm.
that told them who they were. Second, they performed this sacred story in some ways in an unvarying ritual. Third, this ritual gave them all the sense of being connected to eternity, being taken outside of time, and they performed it. And fourth, most interesting to me, is they used their bodies in performing this ritual. Now, Connerton there is writing as an anthropologist. He's not writing about, is this true, is this false, but he's saying how they make their sacred story real to themselves. And
Mhm.
if they lost the ability, if they quit using their bodies to perform this story, or quit performing this story in an unvarying way, then they would forget their sacred story ultimately. He's saying that it has to be, he has this beautiful phrase, the sacred story was, quote, sedimented into their bones.
Mhm.
Now,
Mhm.
we can look
Mhm.
as Christians, you and I can look at the liturgy as being part of that, not just the liturgy on Sunday morning, but the daily liturgies of everyday life, right?
Right.
Like one of the things I love is to go to, when you go to Italy and go into old Italian cities, you see these little shrines built up to
On the
embedded.
corners, and yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. All of these are part of daily liturgies that remind people of the sacred story. Now, it does require you to engage with the sacred story. Otherwise, it's just decoration. And I talk also in the book Living in Wonder about how we do have to have some sort of active involvement, engagement with the artifacts that tell us who we are, with the sacred artifacts. And I use this guy, Hartmut Rosa, a
Mhm.
German sociologist, to talk about this. It's his way of talking about enchantment. He calls it resonance.
Mhm.
He said that when we feel at home in the world, there's something about human nature that feels a sense of resonance with the physical world around us.
Mhm.
We feel we resonate more in some places, say in nature, than we do
Mhm.
in others.
Yeah.
And he says to get resonance, you have to have these things present. I mean, you have to be able to have some kind of connection with the thing you see or a person you see.
Mhm.
It can't just be something that is wholly inaccessible. And you have to form some kind of relationship with it. None of this has to be
Mhm.
articulated,
Mhm.
but you have to feel in some sense that you're connected to this object, to this song, to this ritual, or to this person.
This place.
This place, yeah. Now, the problem, he said, and this is something so modern, is when you try to control it, when you try to corral the thing and make it do what you want it and need it to do. There's something about human nature that when you can control this thing, it becomes a dead thing.
Mhm. Mhm.
This is why the idea of looking for a religion that makes you happy, or it's a dead end, because in the end, when it only does what you want it to do, there's no mystery left, there's no resonance, there's no enchantment. So I just bring that up to say that, going back to the embodied thing, To live in an enchanted world is to live in an embodied world, a world in which the truth and reality is not just something inside our heads, but behind the citadel that modernity has constructed. Kayla, you talk a lot about Charles Taylor and his idea of the buffered self and modernity, the idea that we do live with our brains inside a citadel with all the pressures of the exterior world walled off from us. The enchanted self, by contrast, is porous, not buffered, meaning that we have these forces, we're interacting with them all the time. I think that that's what we're going back to, whether we want it or not. And I think that AI is a big part of that.
Yeah, I think that's an important part, right? That I notice a lot with, sort of going to roughly call them these kind of productivity bros, the sort of these people who are trying to kind of hack the human, existence. And, so they will have all of these kind of, they're adopting these sort of these practices of embodiment, but they're doing it so as to sort of optimize for productivity. And it seems to me that is trying to take some kind of ancient wisdom and again, sort of putting that in something that I can use almost like magician like, so that I can exert control. And what you seem to be saying here with Rosa and this concept of resonance, that it's not really so much that you can sort of take and operationalize, but rather there's a kind of fundamental receptivity that you seem to be suggesting. What's going on?
Yeah, in the book, I talk about the work of Tanya Luhrmann from Stanford University. She's an anthropologist there. And she writes about this stuff, the religious experience. And she has this great book called How God Becomes Real. Now, in it, she doesn't take a position on whether or not God actually exists, but she goes and spends time with religious communities, not all of them Christian, some of them pagan, whatever, to ask them, how do you get yourself in the position of believing that you are hearing from God and you're experiencing God? And she draws some lessons from that. I put them in the book, not because follow this formula and you will conjure God. Rather, it's like putting on a pair of glasses to see the world or to see the unseen more clearly. And, one of them, she says, is to have what she calls a faith frame. That is a framework that allows you to make sense of the numinous, where it's not just random noise. You need to also be embedded in a community of knowledge where you can talk about these things and they can correct you. It's like, no, you're not really hearing, or yes, they go with that. And you have to also have the expectation that you're going to see something. One of the things that I think is so fascinating about this whole story is the idea that there is no pure human way of seeing things. Seeing requires subjectivity. I tell a story in there.
Filtering, right?
Yeah. Well, I one of the chapter 2 is about the weird phenomenon, capital WEIRD, Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And it's a book that was a concept that was first defined by Joseph Henrich, who's now at Harvard, also an anthropologist. And he said that social scientists discovered, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, that all of the studies in psychology that had been done on Westerners, on Western grad students. And so they made a big mistake, he said, because they thought that in doing these studies on these young people, that it was that they were getting to something universal. In fact, there's something very particular about people in the West that doesn't really track with the way people outside the West experience reality. So one of the things I wanted to do in this chapter is to help my readers understand that, the things that we're told about what's real and what isn't, a lot of that is culturally conditioned. And I tell an actual story I got from a book called, with the great title, Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes. By Daniel Everett. He's an American linguist who early in his life was living in the Amazon jungle. He and his family had gone in there to be missionaries to this one particular Amazonian tribe that was considered the hardest to reach for the gospel. And he figured out why when he learned their language, that they had a way of accepting a framework that told them what is real and what isn't, by which they would only believe something was real if they were told it by someone who had seen it or who had heard it from someone who had seen it.
Mhm.
Well, if you think about it for half a second, this makes history impossible, because you can say a man landed on the moon, and they simply could not accept it was real because of their framework.
Yeah.
Anyway, the key thing, though, is that one morning Daniel Everett and his daughter were living in their hut by the riverbank, and they were awakened by the natives running down to the riverbank and screaming and pointing at a sandbar. Everett and his daughter run out there and like, what's going on? They say, don't you see that Shiga guy? He was a river demon.
Mhm.
They're like, no, nothing is there.
Mhm.
And so they went back and forth, and Everett said in his book that, they could not convince him and his daughter that there was something there, and him and his daughter couldn't have convinced them. He later lost his religious faith, became an atheist, went back and made his name as a linguist. But he says in his book, and I wrote him to ask him about this, he still stands by it. He said, there's something mysterious about what happened on that riverbank that day. I still, even though I'm an atheist, cannot bring myself to believe that there was nothing there. And I think this just testifies to how there's something about our subjectivity that either causes us, you could say cause these natives to see something that wasn't there and to imagine it was there, or caused Everett and his daughter to miss something that was there, but that the natives had access to.
Yeah, I remember the first time I saw you, tell this story, which was probably more than a decade ago. Back on one of your old blogs way back in the day, and it's just always struck me. And as I sort of have ruminated on this story for a long time, and in keeping with what you're talking about here, Rod, that this is one of those interesting insights that I think the postmodernists have sort of opened up for us, right? That so many of us, whether we would have considered ourselves traditionalists or conservatives or just liberals, are so steeped in the worldview that we have been raised in, that even our Christianity. So, for instance, you and I, even the Christianities that we have grown into and built out as adults, it's almost as if they're resting on a kind of a fundamental kind of modernist hubris, right?
Mm.
That is sort of empirical, and it's materialist in all of its assumptions. And we kind of, sort of sprinkle a little patina of, woo from here and there. But when it comes down to it, we're the white guys sitting on the beach watching the natives talk to the demon, the river demon,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so what I'm struck with then with this, in light of what you've been talking about with McGill, Chris, that it's possible that the problem is the hubris of our own frame. There, that how do you have a perspective on the frame when you don't posit that there's anything outside of the frame?
Yeah, just last week I was having dinner with a friend of mine here in Budapest who is a confirmed atheist, or at
Mhm.
least a very strong agnostic.
Mhm.
And I was asking her about different miracles, or things that are claimed as miracles. I told her some of the stories, and she's not a Christian, so she had no idea that the Catholic Church has actually very stringent criteria for judging these things today. And I would present her with things that were really, really difficult to dismiss. And
Mhm.
she was reaching for the most outlandish, extravagant, naturalistic explanations. And I said, "Don't you think it requires more faith to believe what you're saying
Mhm.
than to say that something happened here that I can't explain?" And she had to admit that it's true. Well, I talk about this to some extent in the book, about how there's a will to disbelief that
Mhm.
a lot of
Mhm.
people have. I think people lie to themselves and say, well, if I saw a miracle, or then I would believe. No, it's not true. Not true for
Well,
everyone.
absolutely. I mean, Paul Vanderklay tells the story all the time of the selection in C.S. Lewis's Miracles, in which the one friend of his who admits out loud that experienced the miraculous is one of his friends who doesn't believe in God, doesn't even believe in miracles, right? So the experience of a miracle, in no way, I think we, like you said, I think we kid ourselves into thinking, well, if God would just sort of show me a sign, then I'd be fine. But I don't think it really works that way, does it?
No. Because again, it's all about receptivity. I tell a story in the book about the American novelist Tobias Wolff, who, when he was 27 years old, I think it was, he's much older now, but he was raised Catholic, went to Lourdes for the summer, even though he didn't really believe, but he thought it would be a nice, decent thing to do, to volunteer at Lourdes and help the people who come there seeking the cure to get into the waters.
Yeah.
He tells a story about how he was functionally blind. He had really bad eyesight, but he was too vain as a young man to wear glasses. Anyway, the day comes, it's in August. He's assigned to carry this little Italian girl who was a quadriplegic into the waters in Lourdes. And he carries her in there. Then he accompanies her back to the plane on the tarmac to get with her group to fly back to Italy. And he said he was there with her. It's taken him a while to load the plane, and it was so hot. They were just sweat pouring off, and he was trying to keep the flies off this little girl. And she was suffering so patiently. And then the door slams to the aircraft, and the little girl is still there. They've forgotten her. And he runs over and he starts banging on the door of the aircraft, saying, "Open up, open up." And they did, and they got her on, but he was just sobbing out of just pity and mercy on this child. Well, he says that on the bus back, he suddenly starts to see. He realizes, wait a minute, I can see clearly. He's not wearing glasses. His eyes were healed. And he's like, I've experienced a miracle. He felt this overwhelming urge to go to the grotto at Lourdes and pray. But when he gets back to the dorm, he runs into this Irish guy who was there with him that summer, says, "You're never going to guess what happened." So they went and got a beer. And, well, of course, he never goes back to pray.
Right.
At the grotto. He wakes up the next morning, his eyes are back to normal. And he told this story many years later and says that the truth is, he didn't want that miracle then, because if it were true, he would have to change his life in ways he didn't want to change it. And I think, Cale, I bring that up as an example of, we got to be honest with ourselves. You know, when I heard that story from Monsignor Sanchez at age 23, 24, I didn't want to hear it, because I didn't want to change my life. I did not want to become a Catholic. I mean, I wanted it, but I didn't want it, because I knew that to be an honest Catholic would mean I would have to change my life in ways I didn't want to do. Yeah. But it struck me with so much force that I knew I was a fraud if I couldn't unhear what that old man had told me. And the fact that he wept as he was telling me, and it changed his life completely. He was going on to a great career as an art historian. He had introduced Diego Rivera and Orozco to American life, and yet he threw it all away to be a priest. And he wanted to go work among the Indians back home in Guatemala, but because he was from a wealthy family and was a priest, his name was put on a hit list for communist rebels. So his bishop sent him to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where he labored in obscurity for the rest of his life. Nevertheless, if this book I've written does any good, it'll be in part because of the testimony of Carlos Sanchez that day. So
taking a sort of a step outside of the guts of the book and a little bit sort of back to the phenomena of the book, can you give us any insight into sort of the Odyssey to get this thing to print? I mean, what was that process like?
This had never happened to me before. The book, my last two books were published by Sentinel, an imprint of Penguin Random House, Benedict Option, Live Not by Lies, which did very well for them.
I just want to point out, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people understand this because they probably watch and listen to a lot of stuff that we watch and listen to, but books don't make it, right? I mean, like, there's a harsh kind of mathematics to books that sell and books that don't sell. I mean, most books don't sell. I mean, so the fact of the matter is that you have had two books, your previous two books have done incredibly well in an industry that is really looking for books to do well here. So anyway, go ahead.
So this third one was going to go with same publisher, but and they were very generous to me with an advance, but also generous for giving me more time when the divorce bomb blew up and I was paralyzed. But in the end, I couldn't see eye to eye with the editor on content. And
so this is the first time for you this process? Okay, yeah.
And it got to be so bad. I think that my editor was a believing Christian, but I think was also someone who was really uncomfortable with all the woo. and I don't know if that was the reason, but that was one of the things we argued about. But anyway, we got to the point where she said, "Look, this is not working out. Just irreconcilable differences in vision." And by the time she said that, I was actually grateful for it, because I had a story that I wanted to tell, and it wasn't the story that she had agreed in her mind. She had agreed to publish. So my agent found another publisher, and I'm so happy with it. Zondervan, of all people, one of the leading evangelical publishers. I never imagined that I would ever publish with an evangelical imprint, but they gave me total freedom. They gave me a fantastic editor, a guy named Paul Pastor, who is an evangelical Anglican, but he completely gets the woo. And I told him, I said, I'm an Orthodox Christian. I have a Catholic background, and I'm really concerned that I might not be able to relate to evangelical readers. And I'm glad I'll have you there to guide me, to help me understand that. He said, listen, things have changed so much in our country, in our culture, in the last 5 years or so, that there are a lot of evangelicals who are going to be open to hearing what you have to say. They may not agree with it. They'll be open to it in ways that they might not have been before. But I tried to include in the book some evangelical stories. Like I told the story of John Mark Comer, who is a well-known pastor and writer. I met him backstage in 2020 during COVID at an event in Nashville. And I said, "Oh, you're the Benedict option guy. Wow, when your book came out," he's from Portland, Oregon. He said, "When your book came out, we all thought you were alarmist, but now in Portland, we're living it, huh?" And I thought, "Oh, great to hear, I guess." But then I told him that I was thinking of working on this new book about enchantment. He told me a story about how his wife had been delivered only like a couple of weeks ago from a curse. I'm like, wait, really? Tell me about this. Because don't thought that way.
Right.
Well, turns out she had, I'll make the story very short. Turns out she's from Mexico and had come down with this very rare and weird disease, facial disease, that was causing her entire face to go into uncontrollable spasms. And it was incurable. It had gotten to the point where she couldn't even go out in public. It was so bad. And there's nothing they could do. Well, her brother, if I'm remembering this right, her brother back in Mexico said, about our grandmother. Grandmother had an affair with either grandmother or great-grandmother, had an affair with the Cuban ambassador, who was married, but had put his wife back in Havana in an insane asylum, and had carried on with his common law wife in Mexico. Well, it turns out that the imprisoned wife back in Cuba had hired a black magician, a sorcerer, to put a curse on her usurper and all of her subsequent generations. And the curse was that the firstborn child of every generation subsequent would die or get some horrible disease. Lo, it had happened. And Mark's wife was the one of her generation. So being evangelical, they just went to not an exorcist, but a deliverance pastor who had a gift for deliverance, and he prayed over them. Mark told me, now this had only happened like 2 weeks before we spoke.
Whoa.
Mark said, I was there when he prayed over her, and I watched her face go from being just shaken to being completely smooth.
Wow.
And she was delivered of that curse. And so it taught him, as an evangelical, this world is real. And Tammy Comer later on this fantastic podcast I listened to called The Exorcist Files, that's sponsored by this exorcist named Father Carlos Martins, a Catholic priest. Tammy Comer told this story. And it was just as her husband had told me, and she's still free of this horrible thing. But this is what I mean, Cale, by saying that the world is not what so many people think it is. There's a great metaphor that Ian McGilchrist uses, where he says, today in our materialist world, we're like people who are given a magnifying glass, and we can look into a puddle and we can see all kinds of life there that we couldn't see with our naked eyes. And we think, aha, we really got technology here. Then we turn it to the stars and we can't see the stars through it. So we say, aha, the stars don't exist.
Yeah, I great. It's an amazing story about the Comer's wife. Right, because it reminds me, I don't know if you remember this with your own children, but there was a certain developmental point with each of my children in which if they covered their eyes, they thought that I couldn't see them.
Hmm.
Like we're talking, within that first year, right? You could sort of play games with them and that sort of thing. And it's as if we sort of scaled out culturally, like we have kind of done this and we have pretended that the spirits aren't real because we can't see them and they can't see us in some sort of strange sort of way. What you keep hammering home, and you're going through a kind of incredible bibliography, some of the things of which I've read because you and I have sort of texted back and forth on it, but it's an incredible bibliography. But the world is just spectacularly strange in ways that just simply aren't accounted for by the kind of the official story.
Yeah, and we say, and our need for control is so great that we have people who are insisting that it must be true. The secular materialist account must be true because
we flew to the moon, right?
Then yeah, maybe the religious people are onto something, And one thing that I really went heavy in one chapter about the occult, and I did it partly, and what brings it to mind is you talking about the need to control.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people who think they can just dabble in the occult and still control it, and it won't take them over. And this is something that, the testimony of exorcists as well as people who came out of the occult say, no, it's not true at all. Do not open those doors. You won't be able to close them. And the reason it was important for me to include the chapter of the occult in here, is because of a story that you and I have probably talked about before in our previous podcast. We were a young Anglican ordinand in Oxford came to me a couple of years ago and knew I was working on this book and said, I think you need to be aware that in my generation, the new atheism is dead. Again, 27 years old. And he said, that's something for your generation, but nobody really cares about atheism in my generation. I'm like, well, what do they care about? The occult. They're not really going into the church either, but it's not like they're going. Some of them are becoming formal witches, but mostly they're living with some mishmash, some bricolage of conventional religion, some occult, kind of like the syncretism you see in Latin America and the Caribbean.
It's like an American version. It's becoming this sort of Western European American version, which is less sort of monsters and dragons and more tech and AI.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's where I see the syncretism. It's a neo-syncretism, isn't it?
Yeah, no, there's that, but there's also some old-fashioned occult. And he told me this story that I still tell people that and their eyes bug out, that he worked in an ad firm in London before he went to seminary. And he was the only Christian there, which is not surprising. It's London, it's an advertising. But he said every other person in the office, there were no atheists. Every other person was involved in the occult to one degree or the other. And there were even two full-blown Satanists who defined Satanism as learning how to live up to your fullest human potential. And he went on to tell me that he knows, this young ordinand, he said, I know that this is what I'm going to be contending with for the rest of my life as a priest. And it's something that the whole church is going to be contending with, but nobody knows it. The older people don't know it and don't want to think about it.
Boy, that really resonates, Rod.
Are you seeing this?
Well, it really resonates as I see, and maybe this is just the sort of the Gen Xer in both of us, but we're between these two mega, relatively speaking, mega generations, right? And you're caught between Boomerland and then whatever's sort of coming up next. And I see that, and yet we're ruled by a gerontocracy, aren't we? Right? I mean, everybody in all of the various institutions are really old, and they're still kind of waging the initiatives of the 60s and the 70s, and they're preparing, like for instance, in my own church, it's as if the hierarchy is preparing perpetually for the age of Aquarius, and like the age of Aquarius is done. We're talking about like real occult things.
Sure. And I talk in there at great length with this academic who went through the occult as a full-blown occult worshiper. And what's so interesting about this, I think this is going to be one part of the book that gets a lot of commentary, is the blending of the occult world, the traditional occult world, demons and all that, with tech and with AI.
Yeah.
so many of the people who are in San Francisco Bay Area involved in the tech world are full-blown occultists. And a lot of them believe, and I got some of this from reading Dana Pasulka's books, they really do believe that the aliens are not actual creatures from other planets, but transdimensional beings that Christians might call demons, and that we can access them, we can communicate with them telepathically, and they're here to bring us enlightenment. When I encountered this, I was near the end of the book, and I think this might have been the thing that caused my editor the first editor to break with me, because it was just too weird. But the whole UFO thing is an occult phenomenon.
Yeah, and like I was listening to you speak today, and what you were talking about in terms of practices. We're really talking about kind of old school invocations, like as in just sort of a summoner, some sort of old school, witch, right? Where when I was reading Pasulka, especially when you were talking about, when she was talking about like Tyler D, for instance, he has these sort of protocols that she calls them protocols, or I think he might call them protocols. But these, I'm reading this book, and like those are just prayers, right? Like he is like prepare, like it's the same thing when you and I sit down to pray the rosary or to do the Jesus prayer and work the beads and the ropes. It's a preparation, it's a protocol to get yourself in the position to be able to see and to be able to hear. This is and again, what is frustrating to me about the enchanted discussion, and I think you hit this, and this is why you probably included this stuff on the occult, is that it's not just like fuzzy angels, pretty angels floating around on clouds. I mean, there's a real dark side to this that I don't sense we, the church especially, but politics, et cetera, too. Normies are just not quite prepared for that side of the equation.
Yeah, no, you're right about that, Cale. I mean, if you want enchantment, you can't pick and choose enchantment you want. If you want the angels, you've got to take the demons too. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons I included in one of the opening stories of the book, the story of Nino, the Chicago guy.
Yes, yeah.
Seeing the UFO as a teenager, living in New England, and then 6 years later, he's in law school in Chicago studying for the bar, and a portal opens up in his kitchen. These two beings shimmer through it, and they start communicating with him telepathically, and they keep coming back. And I asked him when we first talked about this, I said, did you ever pray in front of them? He said, well, yeah. I said, what happened? He goes, well, they went away both times. I said, didn't that make you think that there might be something demonic here? You're a Catholic. And he said, I never thought about it that way. I just assumed that if they were demons, they'd want to fight. Well, he ended up, as I mentioned, at my advice, going to see the exorcist of the archdiocese, who said, "Yep, we've seen this," and so it hasn't happened to him since. Let me just leave it at that. The point is simply this: I believe that the world is being prepared for something. That this world today would probably not accept full-blown demons manifesting like that. But we have been prepared through a century of science fiction and the worship of science and technology to accept a version of these creatures that come in through that way. And it's not just me that says that. This guy, Jacques Vallée, who is like the grand old man of UFO studies, he's not a Christian at all. He's in the 80s, lives in San Francisco, on the internet. Talks about how it's his theory, and he's been very public about this, that what UFOs are just the contemporary version of creatures or entities that have manifested in different guises throughout the human past. And so, this is a very old story playing out in technological and scientific terms. And when you read that and you realize how divorced that we have become in the modern world from traditional faith, it's really frightening. And I hope this book helps prepare people to live in an enchanted world, because this is coming whether we want it or not.
Yeah, and one of the things that is the last thing, and I'll open it up to a quick question, because I know you got a hard start, and I'm happy to stick around, folks, to answer any questions. But just real quick, what do you make of the kind of almost knee-jerk reaction amongst Christians, either to automatically assign everything as demons, number one, or the other way around, like, oh, everybody just says it's demons, like, get over yourselves. I mean, there's this interesting dynamic that goes on that seems to actually miss the point.
Yeah, yeah. Well, they're both wrong. I mean, a lot of things really can be completely explained without reference to the paranormal, and but some things can't be. I think that we make a false distinction when we draw a line between the natural and the supernatural. I think it's all basically one thing, and that there are things that happen that are part of the natural world that we have uh, decided are can only be understood in terms of the supernatural. I'm not going to get into the whole Aquinas. It was Aquinas who talked about nature and supernature. The Orthodox, and I'm Eastern Orthodox, have a different view
Yeah.
of it.
Yeah.
But I do think that one way to resolve this is to get rid of the distinction between the natural and the supernatural, and instead to think of it all as one thing, that perhaps what we now call supernatural is just the natural or behaving in ways that we can't really explain.
All right, so I got a couple of quick questions for you, Rod. I know you got to go, so I've listened, Grizz. I've starred the ones that showed up earlier on. So let's see if we can do this. So Griswold Grimm, friend of ours, friend of the show's here, says that book sounds more hopeful that Jesus will tarry another century or so. What is your sense of that?
I really don't know. I talk about this with different friends. A friend just asked me yesterday, "Do you think we're in the end days?" And I said, "I really don't know." You can. That's a good way to make a lot of money by saying, "Hey, we're here at the end," but you can also be made a fool of that way. I know that at some point Jesus will return, but whether we are at the end of the world or at the end of a world, I can't say. I can definitely say we're at the end of a world. We're going into a post-Christian world. We are there now. And that is going to mean a very different framework. A lot of this occult stuff that was just totally fringe, even as late as my own childhood, is now going to be very, very mainstream and paganizing.
Yeah, I noticed, in the book, I think my takeaway from your book as regards to this question, Rod, is basically, look, whatever happens is going to happen. We have to learn how to see and hear and become embodied one way or the other, right?
Yeah.
That independent of some sort of grand telos of of God's providence and creation, we're going to have to learn how to do this because we're kind of dying.
Yeah, well, I say at the end of the book that Karl Rahner,
Yes.
the Jesuit theologian, said in the last century, he said, Christianity of the future will be mystical or it won't be at all. And what he meant by that was we are going to have to rediscover the mystical core of Christianity, the Christian faith, the Christian experience, or it's going to dissolve away in modernity. I think that is really true. And I tell a story at the end. This is going to probably cause a lot of people to talk.
I love it. I didn't want to ask about it because I didn't know if I could talk about it, but go ahead.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's, I hope that people will, I should say before we get into this, I hope that people will go pre-order the book on Amazon.
Thank you.
It'll be out October 22nd, but you can pre-order it now. It'll be there waiting for you when it comes out. Anyway, I tell in the book for the first time publicly that I had a mystical experience myself, an actual vision back in 1993. A few months before I came into Catholicism. Nothing like that had happened before, and nothing has happened like it since. I don't give too many of the details away because some of this stuff is just too private, but I had a dream or a vision of an apocalypse, not the apocalypse, but something apocalyptic that was going to happen. And it ended with audibly, interiorly, I heard the words, but don't, you will lose your reason, but don't be afraid, for the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, will triumph. Boom, it let me go. And I called a friend who had asked me to pray for him, and he took this as a sign of what he should do. And I thought that was great. But then I was so shaken up because this was the weirdest thing. Nothing had happened. And it was so powerfully symbolic, all the things that came. So I went to my room and got my Bible, which I barely read. I was just becoming a Christian then. I was sitting in my living room in Washington, D.C., dead of winter. The windows are closed, the heat is on, and I felt blow across the side of my face a cool breeze. And as it crossed my face, it also seemed to blow through me and leave the words Revelation 5:5 in my mind. By then, I was like, oh my God, what is happening? So I turned to Revelation 5:5, and it's St. John is at the wedding feast of the Lamb, and no one has been found worthy to open the seven seals. That verse says, an elder said to me, do not weep, for the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has triumphed and been found worthy to open the seals. In that moment, I knew that what had happened to me that evening was real.
Mhm.
Even though I couldn't fully interpret all of the symbols I was able to do it eventually. But it guided me in my writing for all of my life. And I think that Benedict Option, Live Not by Lies, they all came out of this original vision, which I should say 30 years on, I live to see it come true. The things that are going on in the world now, I don't want to get too specific, but they've all happened. The things that I was shown in 1993, but I was given a very special way to anticipate it. I still think that there are parts of this vision that I still have yet to understand. And in fact, I came to understand in the completion of this book that you will lose your reason. I think what that meant was all of us in our civilization, we will become completely irrational. And I think that reason will not work anymore. I think this was a way about the Enlightenment. We're post-Enlightenment now. Rationality does not work, but that we as Christians have got to hold on to the faith, which teaches us that no matter what is to come, no matter what suffering is to come, we can know by faith that the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has triumphed. Not will triumph, has triumphed. It's done. So that gives me so much strength through faith that we can make it through whatever's coming. At the same time, it helps me understand why it meant so much to me to write this book about re-enchantment and rediscovering mystical Christianity as sort of the third of what has become an inadvertent trilogy. Benedict Option, Live Not
Yeah.
by Lies, now Living in Wonder.
Yeah, and it's great. Now you can add to your biography when you get announced at fancy conferences. You can now announce that you're officially an experiencer, right? In that Pasolkian term, right? I think it's true. I think this is it makes so much sense for me and just all the various conversations that we've had. Well, look, Rod, you got a heart out here, so I want to let you go. I want to thank you very much. I've got questions here. I'm sorry we haven't quite gotten to, but I think whatever. Time is what it is, and so I'm sorry to.
Yeah, sorry I have to run, but I have a meeting tonight. But thank you for having me on, Cale. It's great to be with you again, and I hope that that your listeners will go pre-order the book, because I mean, we all hope our books will be a big splash, but I think this one is going to be special because it's really capturing a moment. I was saying to you earlier today, we were looking at the pictures of the mass of young people at the Chartres pilgrimage in France. All these young people, the churches are emptying in France, but all these young people want the mystical experience that was there for their medieval ancestors there at Chartres. So, and that's where I first started my path of Christianity or Chartres. So this is where the life is. This is where the energy is. This is where the future is. And, the book I've written for unbelievers, but also for Christians who feel that their faith has become very dry and want to become reacquainted with that mystical aspect of it, which is at the core.
Yeah, and just to end on that Ronner quote, and I'll let you go here, and the guys in the chat, I'll stick around if you have any questions. But that Ronner quote, which is, where we're headed, you'll either be a mystic or you'll be nothing, and that's not that never has strict that has never struck me as triumphant. Almost like kind of like a resignation on the part of Ronner. I'm not sure if that resonates with you.
Could be.
All right, brother. Be well. Enjoy Budapest. We'll see you soon, man.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All right, folks. Sorry, I did not give. Oh, wait, where? Let me cut him out. Okay. All right, Rod, I'll let you go. All right. So I promised more Q&A, and so I did not deliver on that. Apologies. I'm new at this. I probably made some mistakes, but anyway, if you got any questions, let's see. You had a Upcycle had a question that was probably more for Rod, but Upcycle asked, how can re-enchantment help us restore a sense of wonder and awe? How is that different from placing one's faith in Lord Jesus Christ? Well, I mean, I just take it to mean the same thing. That in order to have faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, you have to have a fully enchanted version of that. But and I think that's probably what Rod would say. All right, let's see. Question. I'm scrolling here. Sorry. Let's see. Mike says previously, Rod wrote about how nominalism has derailed right reason. How do you see nominalism as having prepared us for an age of anti-Christian reenchantment? Mike, there's a section in the book where Rod revisits exactly this, and he talks about the sort of the temptation of the noetic, which is that kind of like head knowledge sort of idea, and that's the great temptation of the Western Church, right? Both in their Catholic and Protestant varieties, is that we've sort of gone full speed ahead into that the sort of the realm of the idea as opposed to the sort of the realm of embodiment. So I think that I think that's one of his culprits that he lays out there. Let's see. Sorry, can't answer that one. Grim. I know, Grim. I know. I'm a rookie. What do you want? This is Grim's. I need more than our Dacuna. Yes, I know. I'm sorry. I'm trying. Okay. Well, it looks like that's everybody. There are no more. Wait. Do we have a question? A pre-order link. All right, I can do that. Let's see. I will find it real quick. Amazon. Don't worry, I do not get any money for any of this. Much to my my Twitter haters' chagrin, I don't make any money off any of this stuff. So if I am a grifter, then I am grifting really poorly. Really poorly. That was probably not the way to do it, was it, Grim? Anyway, pre-order Rod's book. It really is great. I read it this weekend, and I had to read it quickly, to be honest with you. But it's really good. I'm going to go back and revisit it. Some great stories, and it really forefronts the stories. Those of you from this little corner, okay, thanks, Grim. Those of you in this little corner, it's a real bibliography of all the stuff PVK has been talking about. There's sections on McLuhan and Vervaeke and Matthew Crawford and Nagel and Ian McGilchrist and Hartmut Rosa and Tanya Lerman and a bunch of others. It's Deanna Pasulka, Carlos Ayer. It's really it's really quite good. Yeah. So Grim, I don't wear a bow tie every day. That was just the branding. So sometimes I wear the good old fashioned tie like this, as I'm leading our youth in Always Literary. Okay. So, Anthony got a question here. I had a chat. How is the reenchantment of the world related to the goodness of the world and of human persons? Is it saying something about the inherent goodness of the world? Well, one of the things that Paul has talked about and Rod talks about in the book is that the genius of Christianity and the sort of the engine of its spread is not really in the area of ideas or messages, but really in the arena of miracles. And I think reenchantment, this path to reenchantment, remember it's sort of a little bit of a misleading term, reenchantment, and Rod talks a little bit about that in the book. It really is more of a rediscovery of the enchantment that is part of the makeup of reality, right? So that part of what you need. Why do you need reenchantment? Well, you need reenchantment in some sense to tap back into the miraculous core of our faith. And Jesus, the wonder worker, and the wonder working of the early church, is something that we kind of skip over especially as we operate in this imminent frame, this iron box of modernism. And that what you see time and time again. And one of the things I really loved about Rod's book is that he has all of these incredible stories, these testimonies, these and that is really where I think the reenchantment is found. That miracles move people, and ideas almost come in the aftermath, as a way of kind of explaining in some sense or fitting it into a worldview. But the miracles are the thing. And in that way, you read a book like this, They Flew, you read that and you realize that, man, things are just really weird, and really strange. And there are weird and strange things happening all the time outside of the WEIRD, acronym world. And I think that is, to sort of bring this into a little bit of Jordan Peterson, I think that is, he is correct that is what postmodernism has afforded us in some interesting ways. It has allowed us to sort of see things that we have sort of skipped over. So, oh, that's funny, Grizz. That's funny. Yeah. Okay. If there are no questions, I'm sort of tapped out here. As you know, I can probably talk forever, but I'm going to go ahead and take us out. By the way, I want to give props to Upcycle for the opening branding, and then I'm going to do some closing branding here, given to me, I should say, by none other than Chad the Alcoholic. So thank you guys for that. Thank you for the support. Mandy, you can replay it. It was pretty good, I think. But here we go. Here's our branding, and I'm out of here. We'll talk next time. I'm going to try to do these things more often. Here is Chad's branding. Arrivederci. Wheels Within Wheels by Seamus Heaney. The first real grip I ever got on things was when I learned the art of pedaling by hand a bike turned upside down and drove its back wheel preternaturally fast. I loved the disappearance of the spokes, the way the space between the hub and rim hummed with transparency. If you threw a potato into it, the hooped air spun mush and drizzle back into your face. If you touched it with a straw, the straw frittered. Something about the way those pedaled treads worked very palpably at first against you, and then begun to sweep your hand ahead into a new momentum. That all entered me like an access of free power, as if belief caught up and spun the object of belief in an orbit coterminous with longing. But enough was not enough. Whoever saw the limit in the given anyhow? In fields beyond our house there was a well, the well we called it. It was more a hole with water in it, with a small hawthorn tree on one side and a muddy, dungy ooze on the other, all tramped through by cattle. I loved that too. I loved the turbid smell, the sump life of the place like old chain oil. And there, next thing, I brought my bicycle. I stood it, saddle and its handlebars into the soft bottom. I touched the tires to the water's surface, then turned the pedals until, like a mill wheel pouring at the treadles, but here reversed and lashing a mare's tail, the world refreshing and immersed back wheels spun lace and dirt suds there before my eyes and showered me in my own regenerate clays. For weeks I made a nimbus of old glit. Then the hub jammed, rims rusted, the chain snapped. Nothing rose to the occasion after that, until, in a circus ring, drum-rolled and spot-lit, cowgirls wheeled in, each one immaculate at the still center of a lariat, perpetuum mobile, sheer pirouette, tumblers, jongleurs, ringarosies, stet.